And we have here on this panel people who have, have had a very distinguished career in politics and who have stood for the public good. I'm speaking about former Taoiseach John Bruton, former EU ambassador to the United States and many other things, former Minister Noel Dempsey. Jerry Buttimer is, if you like, politics present, in that he's chairman of the Health Committee, so he's going to bring a perspective from that. And Kieran Coughlan has had a very distinguished career as Clerk of the Dáil, for retiring this year after 21 years, and the man who perhaps knows more, maybe even knows more than Art, I think, about. Clearly. So, in fact, Art is a pupil, I think. But I think, and then we have Mary and Meg, and you've already heard what they have to say. So I think it's an extraordinarily good panel, and I'm going to set off with what John and Noel share, apart from their Meaths-ness and being distinguished members of the constituency of Meath, is that both in their day of active political leadership, they were both seen as people advocating for political reform. John, as far back as the 1980s, well before he was Taoiseach, and Noel took up that baton in the 1990s. So, John, you've had the chance to listen a bit for the last hour or so of the debate. A very open question. What are your reflections about perhaps the possibility where do you think the Dáil is at? Mary said it's a very different place than it was 30 or 40 years ago. You were elected in 1969 as the youngest TD at the time, if I recall correctly, and the Dáil was a very different place. Do you want to reflect on the scale of change, and do you want to reflect as well on other changes that you think might make Parliament more efficient?
Things have changed a lot. When I came into the Dáil, there were only three committees, the Committee of Procedure and Privileges, the Committee on Public Accounts, and the Joint Restaurant Committee. Members could speak for as long as they like. I remember on one occasion I spoke for 6.5 hours on the Justice Estimate, only to be followed by Deputy Oliver Flanagan, who to prove that this youngster could be outdone, spoke for 7 hours after I spoke. And all relevant, of course, in both our cases. Anyway, to get down to use my time, I think that the most important function of the Dáil is scrutinising legislation, because legislation will be on the statute book for years. It's far more important even than holding the government to account or providing copy for the newspapers on the latest scandal, whatever that is, because that's something that's ephemeral in many cases, whereas the legislation is sort of semi-permanent. I think the Ceann Comhairle should have the right, independently of the government, if he's not satisfied that a particular piece of legislation has been adequately debated, particularly in committee stage, to order up to an additional 20 hours of time, which the government would have to provide, either on Friday or by delaying its timetable. But it has to be at his discretion. I think also a lot of the opposition amendments in committee stage are time-wasting amendments that are put in just to score political points. And there has to be somebody who can act as a referee and say, well, look, that point has been made. I'm not giving extra time for that amendment, but there's a group of amendments over here, further down the bill, which may not be reached, and I'm going to give time to those. And it has to be somebody so semi-independent, like the Ceann Comhairle, that could make that decision. The biggest problem, in my memory, is with the Finance Bill, because the Finance Bill is one piece of legislation which, under the Constitution, has to be passed within a particular time frame. And I know that the Revenue Commissioners and the Department of Finance will bring in, at the very last minute, rafts of complex amendments which are put through on a guillotine and not discussed. And that's the most serious piece of legislation there is, because that's literally taking money off people. Which is what tax does, and we have to have it. But it should be done fairly. And perhaps the Constitution should be amended to allow more time for the Finance Bill to be considered. I think it's 40 days is probably too short for that. I don't know exactly how that could be done. Perhaps the finance bill would have to be produced earlier or produced in some other form. But, I think in my time, the power of party leaders has increased dramatically, and a lot of it has been due to well-intended reforms. If you think about, priority questions, that enhances the power of the spokesman who's appointed by the party leader, to the detriment of backbenchers. Taoiseach's questions enhances the party leaders to the detriment of everyone else in the Dáil. And I think they should probably be scaled back, because backbenchers, particularly government backbenchers, are the most unutilised pool of talent in the Dáil. And I think then they need to be facilitated in putting down amendments, encouraged to put down amendments, even amendments that the Minister doesn't agree with in committee. And I think Deputy Owen Murphy produced a reform proposal which included that. I think it's very important that the chamber be reasonably full, and I was listening to Derek and others there, but there's no substitute for being there. You can be in your office, but you can't interrupt from your office. And I think there should be much more interruption, structured interruption, like they have in the House of Commons. Will the member please yield? It has always been provision for that. But for some reason, members won't yield and the Count Corla won't encourage them to yield. And there is no to and fro. Also, I think speakers' lists should be abolished. The idea that the whips come in with a speakers' list, and I mean the idea of whips being in charge of Dáil reform is a sort of a contradiction in terms. The whips have no interest in Dáil reform because they want to control the agenda in the interest of their own parties for perfectly legitimate reasons, but they're the last people who I'd be giving Dáil reform to as a responsibility because it's they're in a conflict of interest situation. And I think, and I agree with what the convention seems to be coming to about that, but I'd like to see more interruption. I would like to see the Count Corla calling speakers to speak on debates in terms of how long they've been sitting in the chamber. Now, if you've been in there sitting for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, listening to the other people, then you should get priority to speak over somebody who just comes in with a script. I also think reading of scripts should be discouraged actively. It was at one time contrary to standing orders, I think, or contrary to practice for people to be reading scripts. But it still it certainly happened in my time. Now it's 10 years since I was in the Dáil, but I don't think it's changed very much. And it's bad. It really is bad. The script factory in the press office producing stuff and people reading it out, if that's what's happening, is not what people have been elected to the Dáil to do. I think it's very important that we have a national balance sheet. We have national accounts each year, but the government produces what their income and expenditure for the year is going to be. But they don't produce a national balance sheet which says what are their liabilities in the long term? What are the contingent liabilities, for example, in terms of old age pension as the age structure of the population gets older? What are the contingent liabilities in respect of debts that the government implicitly guarantees that has taken off balance sheet? They should be in the government accounts in the form of a balance sheet so that members of the Dáil will see where the real liabilities are. And I think if we had had better accounting, we might have had... I don't believe that any political system would have stopped the financial crisis. I think that's a mistake to be saying that the Dáil or the Senate or anybody else didn't do their job because there was a financial crisis. There was a collective mania that overtook the Western world, which I don't think any institution here would have stopped happening. And I certainly think if the Dáil had had more power over the central bank would have probably been encouraged to do even less reining in than they did. So I don't think we should, follow that premise. And I think I nearly got through all the points I wanted to make. I agree with Ms. McCarthy about the idea of a career path for deputies being, the possibility of an alternative career path through committees, and we've seen what a good committee can do. Finally, I think this was one of the most frustrating things I had when I was leader of the opposition, or indeed as a spokesperson in the opposition, is that you might want to ask a minister a series of questions. you ask him question A, and then on the basis of question A's answer, you'd have another supplementary and another supplementary. But unless you have only one party in opposition, there's a practice for the Ceann Comhairle of going round the parties, and it then goes to the Labour Party, and then it goes to whichever else party, and by the time you get back to ask your second question, the debate has gone off in a completely different direction. I think we should probably find some way of allowing one member to ask one question and to be able to ask a series of supplementaries and to pursue that question to its logical conclusion.
Thank you very much indeed. You clearly haven't lost your appetite for reform. I'd like to go next to Noel Dempsey, who, again, as even prior to being a minister, had ideas about reform, but perhaps unusually for a minister, was very much identified with ideas, not all of which actually managed to get onto the statute book, it might be said. Noel.
I'm still trying, so thank you for the opportunity to try and influence some more views. I'd preface any remarks that I make about reforming the Dáil with a basic belief, and it won't come as any surprise to anybody, basic belief that I have that until we tackle the more serious issue of electoral reform, we're really not going to be able to get the kind of a parliament that we want. Now, I know the forum, I don't want to open past debates, and I'm sure I won't. I know the forum has already discussed this, and I'm in a minority here, but I still believe very, very strongly, as long as we continue to have an adversarial electoral system, an electoral system that's almost purely based on clientelism, you're not going to be able to make very, very, very significant changes to what happens in Dáil Éireann. Because those two things, clientelism and the adversarial nature of politics that the electoral system gives rise to, are reflected in what happens in the Dáil. And we can talk about committee systems, and I'm a strong advocate of them, and I think they are getting stronger and doing much more effective work, for all the thanks they get in the media for it. I think that is a way forward. But at the end of the day, if we're being honest, unless things have changed very significantly over the last 3 or 4 years, you will have the minister at the committee, you will have the spokespersons for the opposition, most of whom will stay for most of the committee, and then you'll have other members flitting in and out at various times just to put their name down as being present. So there is, and the reason for that is they're too busy doing important constituency work. So I just preface the remarks about that. Throw in what I believe is important, that the committees should continue to be strengthened. And I think I've heard people mention here, and I think Mary may have mentioned it, about a committee week, which I think is important, focused completely on committee work. I think if you want to lengthen the Dáil term, rather than talking about 5 days a week or 4 days a week or whatever else it is, I think have more weeks, but have them purely as committee weeks, I think is something that should be considered. And surprise, surprise, that is something that happened between 1993, when I was whip, to 1997. Very unpopular with deputies. And when the government changed at that time, it quickly disappeared, because it was so unpopular with deputies. And you've heard, I believe, earlier on in the today, some of the reasons why it's unpopular with deputies, and it's perfectly understandable why it might be so. So I think if you're going to talk about more work in the Dáil, I think you talk in terms of 3 days, talk in terms of more weeks perhaps, rather than talking about lengthening the Dáil week. In relation to the Ceann Comhairle, I would strongly believe that the appointment of the Ceann Comhairle by secret ballot would certainly strengthen that position. I think the Ceann Comhairle should have a much stronger role in how the business of the Dáil is conducted. I think his role as protector of the members, particularly opposition members, I'd have to say, is one that should be more formalised and should be advocated an awful lot more. Because his job is to ensure that everybody that's elected there, whether we like it or not, when we're in government, every deputy that's there, you might fundamentally disagree with everything they believe in, but they have been elected by the people, and therefore they should not be treated as second-class citizens within the chamber. And the only one that can guarantee that is the Ceann Comhairle. And I think the only way the Ceann Comhairle can do that is by having his powers strengthened. John's point, I think, there about we're constantly talking. When I was in opposition, I gave out hell about guillotines. When I was in government, they were done as a matter of course. And you can keep going. It doesn't matter who's in government or who's not. Governments are going to use guillotines. Giving John's idea of giving the Ceann Comhairle some power to say, no, we haven't this sufficiently debated, or it hasn't been sufficiently debated. Now, whether the Ceann Comhairle would want this power is another question, but giving him some power to add on time for that, I think, would be very, very valuable. And I have the height of respect for politicians, and I was glad to hear Mary, and I'm sure you've heard it from other people around about. John has said it as well. It doesn't come as any surprise to me to hear Mary saying that the group that came in 2011 are very committed, very dedicated. They want to make a difference. In my experience, I say 98% of the people that I came in contact as politicians over the years all wanted to make that difference. You know, again, contrary to a view that might be put out there a lot of the time in relation to politicians, that they're all in it for themselves and, you know, they're all looking for an angle to it. That is untrue, and it's a disservice to democracy that people would advocate that. But politicians that get elected to Dáil Éireann, whether it's in the electoral system that we have or who are in Dáil Éireann, will be notoriously slow to change systems, because sometimes I think when you're in a bubble, as you would be in any place of employment, you can't see the benefits objectively of perhaps changing things that you're used to. And the other strength, or the other proposal that I think should be considered, is that instead of, as somebody said, John I think maybe said about the whips being in charge of Dáil reform, I think there should be some consideration given to an outside body, not out there people that have no idea about parliamentary procedures or anything else, or the necessity for it, but perhaps a group such as 2 or 3 former members, either a current or former clerk of the Dáil and clerk of the Seanad, 3 citizens, and the Ceann Comhairle chairing it, to bring forward reports on Dáil reform on a regular basis, which could be freely voted on, rather than the government being able to vote them down, and which would bring some balance to it, I think is something that should be considered. I think I'll leave it at that just at the moment.
Thanks very much indeed, Noel. I'd like to turn next, if I may, to Kieran, because he has this vast reservoir of experience. He's seen change, he's collaborated and overseen change in the Dáil over many years. And, you know, I'm going to leave it as open to you. I mean, what do you want to add to this on this topic?
Yeah, right. Thank you, Tom. Yeah. At the first point, I suppose there's a lot of wise words being said by both John and Noel already. The change really was 40 years, really, is that, as said in the paper on the UK this morning, there's been a lot of incremental changes which over time have been very positive. And I think we have to recognise that too, you know, in the sense that, I mean, there's such a ferment for change right now that you think that nothing really could have been done, you know. So I suppose if you were an accounting officer and you had been in before the public accounts in, say, in the 70s, there's a hell of a difference when you go before there now, you know, so it's a different ballgame in that sense. I'd agree primarily, like what John was saying.
We'll make sure you're into the mic. Yeah.
Is the mic on, is it? Oh, yeah.
It's on, yeah. It's on, yeah. Lean into it. Yeah.
Certainly, yeah. I was told that before a public accounts meeting and to save my bacon one time because because what I said before wasn't exactly. But the point that John was making, the emphasis on it being a legislature, that is the primary function of the Dáil and the Senate as well. And I think it can get the accountability thing has been kicked around and quite a bit. But as a legislator, as a legislator is the main point. And I think that you'd have to say some of the changes being made about the pre-legislative scrutiny and so on over time will make a positive change. But a lot of these things, like most kind of institutional reform, can be a slow lead-in. You know, so you see things are happening now that may not actually have a kind of an effect. It doesn't have that kind of instant karma that people tend to want to know, you know. Another point would be, I suppose, the difference between the Dáil then and now is that the members a number of years ago, say 20 years ago, really knew the rules, the existing rules. They knew how to make them work. The modern Parliament doesn't seem to have time. There seem to be discard for the rules, and they rather work around them than actually use them. But there were some remarkable successes before, like with I suppose they just take a party that's gone now, safe enough to call the Democratic Left. I think they had only 4 members one time, and they really ran the show from the Dáil. I mean, they're very effective with the rules in that sense. And that tends to be lost. And as a result then, because of the existing standing orders and so on, tend to be ignored and disregarded in lots of ways. And there's a lot of own goals in the Dáil as well. And a mention was made there of the great work done by committees. The committees then rarely report to the Dáil. The reports are never adopted by the Dáil. So sometimes you can have exchange of press releases from the committees and the minister picking them up and cherry picking them rather than them becoming Dáil policy, and then he's accountable, the minister accountable to the Dáil. So there's a huge level of accountability lost there. And as I say, about the role of Ceann Comhairle, there's some interesting ideas about that. The point, I suppose, really is that, and it's remarkable in this Dáil as well, I think, I wouldn't agree about the backbencher role anymore. I think because it's such a strong overall government majority now, I think the government backbenchers are coming more into play much more than before, despite the structural weaknesses that may be there. And you know, those rights are kind of, they're being more assertive. And the House, basically the power comes from the members themselves. That has to be respected. And whether that could come, I mean, in other parliaments, they have a business committee, this idea was mentioned before as well, and that they would set the agenda collectively. Like the whips meetings tend to be private meetings under the chairmanship of the whip, and tend to be very government dominated. But you could make it more member-centred in that sense, you know. But basically, and I suppose I think I caught on the webcam this morning David Farrell's summation when he linked into Neil Hageley's paper. I mean, the parameters are really about Article 1510. That's where the power of the Dáil comes, and the Constitution entrusts the changes to the Dáil itself. And in the paper by Meg there on the Commons, she made a very interesting point at the end about the cultural change, and Mary made it as well. And that if you don't really interest the members, if you don't have an interest in the reform, it just won't happen. And we've had quite a number, institutionally, we were trying to push things. Actually, in fact, the Dáil Reform Committee itself was pushed strongly by officials because, like all officials, you'd like to see some sort of rules. Because what happens in the Dáil is that the practice comes first and then the rules are changed every so often. I think Maurice McCarthy's paper remarked on that, like there seems to be kind of a 10-year cycle sometimes for the change. That's only the rules catching up with actually what's happening, you know. It's kind of a common law type thing. And so even that, once the whips took over the Dáil Reforms Committee, then it kind of you know, became part of the business management of the place rather than reform. I suppose ultimately the main problem with the Dáil Reform is that members, needless to mention, are very focused on being re-elected, because if any one of us were put in that position, we'd be in a different outlook as well. And so it's trying to get a long-term view. And there's people on the panel, as you remarked yourself, actually took that long-term view in both John and Noel. It's stood out from the crowd in that respect. But generally speaking, it's very hard to get serving politicians to take a long-term view in view of the volatility of the electorate and so on.
Kieran, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to turn now to Jerry, because Jerry is really in a really important position at the moment. He's chairman of the Committee of Health, as I mentioned earlier. He had a particular role in last January in discussing with a number of outside agencies the issue which was to lead to the Protection of Life Bill. So this is really in the category of pre-legislative scrutiny. And Jerry, I think it would be useful if you were to reflect a bit on that, and any other additional matters that you think relevant to this topic.
Thanks, Chairman. Hi, everybody. It's me. Can I just begin by just saying that I'm really feeling adequate next to Noel and John Bruton and Kieran Coughlan, because both Noel Dempsey and John Bruton were pioneering reformers in their time. And John Bruton actually was the leader of the House one time. And I think his point is well made in terms of reform of the Dáil, that it should be somebody separate from the Chief Whip who even is interested in Dáil reform in the present Dáil, but his job is to primarily get legislation passed. But I think it's worth considering. And if I may just begin, Chairman, by just saying that one of the fundamental changes that perhaps we don't recognise in this Dáil is in the context of the pre-legislative hearing, in terms of committee hearing the heads of bill. And it's profound for one important reason, apart from the fact that we engage more. If you begin from what happened in the past, where the Minister for Health, for example, would send a memo to government and his cabinet colleagues would respond back to him or her with the information. Today, it's different. And in the Health Committee which I chair, Minister Fitzgerald was the first minister to refer a bill to us regarding children. And in that case, we brought in a plethora of outside groups, community groups, NGOs, agencies, for the input in the bill. But here's the most important point that we haven't dwelt upon. I don't mean this to be disrespectful, but we're getting engagement from civic society, from ordinary citizens, and we're in a sense taking away the power from the civil service as well, who in the past were the people who wrote the bills. And that's a change where ministers now are getting views from outside the civil service to help formulate policy and to help write legislation. In the context of the Protection of Life during Pregnancy Bill, and I want to compliment Kieran Conway, my Vice Chairman, for the role she played as well in the behind the scenes, in the way she helped and assisted and came up with some great ideas on who we should bring in. Our committee, and I want to make this point quite clearly, and Robert Dowes is here from the Health Committee and Derek Keating was on it as well, is non-adversarial by and large. And that's a credit to Billy Kelleher, to Caoimhín O'Quillan, to Gillian Van Turnout, to Seamus Healy, or whoever else are the spokespeople. I think we've had 2 votes in the Health Committee in the 3 years that I've chaired it. One was on the Protection of Life during Pregnancy, and it wasn't the opposition people who called the vote, it was somebody else. For a different reason, I won't go into that. And the second one was in regard to tobacco, whether we bring in tobacco to the Health Committee on the hearings we're having at the moment regarding plain packaging. And by and large, in the Health Committee that I chair, I'm privileged to say this, there is no grandstanding generally in the committee. So the collegiality is there, the adversarialness is by and large not there. And that occurs both in private session and in public session. But just in regard to the committee work that we do, or did regarding protection of life, we sat down as a committee, we asked the members of the committee and those who were not on the committee to give us a list of suggestions of people or organisations they would like to bring in. We sat down, we went through that as a committee, and we compiled a timetable. And again, I have to say, it was really thorough and time conscious in terms of members weren't rushed, members put aside their views by and large, and acted in the interest of the people that were there to serve. Did it work well? I'm biased, I think it did. We got a wide cross-section of people coming in to discuss the issue. It was a very sensitive one, it was a very emotive one, and we made a decision, and again, here was the other point where the Oireachtas was seen in good light to move to the Shannon chamber to facilitate non-committee members and to allow non-committee members time to speak. So we allocated 65% of time to committee members and 35% to non-committee members, again allowing for the fact that the issue was sensitive. What committee does then in general as well, in terms of the pre-legislative hearing, is we ask for written submission from people. So we put an ad in the, or not an ad, we put a call out by the Oireachtas website and social media and through other outlets that the Oireachtas communications unit use. We also then take in oral submissions from members and non-members and from NGOs or from civic society. Like, for example, last Thursday, we held our second series of meetings on the tobacco heads of plain packaging. And one of the most important presentations that I saw and heard in the Oireachtas came from 3 girls who were in Cashel Community School who were involved in the youth group in Tipperary. And they gave a young person's perspective on smoking, as an example. In the past, that would never have been heard of. Similarly, we hear from a wide group of people whom you wouldn't hear. So in the context of the pre-legislative hearings, it is absolutely, I think, a welcome departure from what was there before. Now every cabinet minister, by and large, has to bring heads of a bill to government. And I think it engages with the members and it also engages with the wider population outside there. The other point in terms of that, Chairman, is that in the committee system, what people at times tend to forget is, in the case of us in Health and Children, the Minister for Health with the HSE must come in 4 times a year. The Minister for Children must come in 4 times a year. That's outside the estimates. That's outside a piece of legislation. And if there's a need, for example, on an issue, the Minister may come in and discuss the issue with the committee. This Minister for Health has brought in the HSE service plan to be discussed at committee. That wasn't done before. Now he comes in with the CEO of the Health Service Executive. So I think Mary's point regarding the committee system is right. Some people are naturally happy in committee and do great work. And I think one of the assets of it is that it gives members an opportunity to go through legislation, it gives members an opportunity to engage, and it brings in society into Leinster House. As Derek rightly said, it's the people's house. I think the benefit of the committee system, Chairman, is that, for example, we can bring in now the appointment of heads of state boards. For example, we brought in Nora Gibbons into the committee before she was appointed. We brought in the new chair of HICWA. And I would perhaps think that as a consequence of what's happened in the controversy with Section 38 and 39 organisations, like, for example, the Central Media Clinic, I think that perhaps the Health Committee could be used as the vehicle to vet or to discuss with the new chairperson or the chief executive of that organisation, at that board, their plans for the organisation. That's where the committee system can be very focused and can get primacy. The other point I would make, Chairman, is the committee week I would see as being absolutely critical, because it allows members an opportunity to be solely focused on that. And in a minute I might just go through an example of an actual Wednesday that I had last week in Leinster House.
Yeah, could you make it quite brief now, because I want to get on to questions.
No, okay, but just like, for example, last Wednesday, just to give members a flavour, I mean, 8:30 meeting regarding local elections, 9:30 quorum duty, 10 to 11 o'clock in the office, going with the office in Cork and my PA in Dublin, 11 o'clock meeting with Secretary General of the Department of Health, 12 noon a meeting with a television company regarding a programme they're doing on health, 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock meeting with the Clerk of the committee, 2:30 with Charlie Flanagan and the Constitution Convention regarding Amnesty International, 3:30 internal Fine Gael Social Protection Committee meeting, 5:30 Parliamentary Party meeting, 5 to 8 speaking in the Dáil, 9 o'clock voting in the Dáil, and that's even before you do any bit of work. As an example of that's just last Wednesday alone. So, I mean, if people think that we're not doing anything, we actually are. I'm not defending us, but that's just an example of a day before we do anything else.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. we've got about 20 minutes left in this session, and rather than because we've heard both from Meg and Mary already, so I think it would be more useful if we go directly to the floor now, and any of the people on the panel here, including obviously Meg and Mary, will be available to answer questions. Yeah, we start with Angus and then Tom. Okay.
Thanks. It's a point that John mentioned about the financial bills and financial measures that the Dáil discusses. One of the problems from an opposition point of view is the restrictions on oppositions to put amendments which will have a charge on the Exchequer or a charge on the people, one of which is restricted by the Constitution and the other then is reflected in the standing orders because of what's in the Constitution. The Constitution prevents members from producing legislation kind of which be a charge in the Exchequer, which is going to be a problem and has already been a problem for opposition, but also government backbenchers. Say, for instance, we have now the new facility where backbenchers or private members' legislation can be produced and discussed on a Friday, but they're ruled out if there's a charge on the Exchequer, which means that takes away a lot of things, even if they're practical and progressive policies, you know, that are not being mischievous. And I think there should be some mechanism to change that. So, for instance, if you're discussing the budget or the financial measures, kind of TDs are opposition TDs are prevented from putting amendments, kind of which means that that part is ruled out of order. So all you can do is criticise the government rather than promote alternatives in amendments.
Thank you. Tom?
Tom Burke. Just 2 points referring back to Noel's comments. By and large, I agree with the proposals made, but Noel said that one of the pillars of the system is based on clientism. Would he not agree that this is encouraged to a large degree by politicians themselves? And the second point is he suggested that the Ceann Comhairle should chair the Dáil Reform Committee. I'd agree with his proposed makeup of the committee, but if the Ceann Comhairle is to fulfil his duty as Ceann Comhairle, how is he going to be available to chair the committee? And by the way, I think, and what I've learned today, politicians do a lousy job at selling themselves.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
We have 4 politicians in our constituency, 2 are ministers. The other 2, I don't know if they're on committees. They certainly don't advertise the fact if they are. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thomas?
Just a couple of points there. I mean, John Bruton gave a very interesting presentation there, but one of the points that he made, and I think this goes to the heart of the matter, is the role of the Dáil to scrutinise legislation, or is it actually a legislator itself that creates its own legislation? And I think the committees that Jerry is talking about there and the pre-legislative hearings, I think that is an excellent idea if the role of the Dáil is merely to examine what a government is putting forward. But really the Dáil and indeed the Shannon together have the power to create their own legislation, and members can do that in theory. And we heard all about the private members' bills that are brought forward on a Friday, but none of them have been introduced at all. Like none has passed. And I think that really that's a challenge for the members as much as anything else. Where do the members see their role as? And I'm afraid that my only concern, and I think it's excellent to bring in, you know, the new structure is excellent, but my only concern is that the Dáil then sees itself in subsidiary light to the government and continues in that role, but just maybe doing a better job at it by actually really examining what the government is putting forward. But really the Dáil should have its role as a legislator. It legislates, it makes the legislation. Just a second point, just in relation to Noel. I mean, in fairness to Noel, he's the one who introduced probably the greatest reform ever, which was the abolition of the dual mandate. But I think it's fair to say that the Irish public haven't entirely reacted to that, and you know, national politicians will still get calls about potholes and roads and issues that are the responsibility of local services, and it's certainly impossible for any member of the Oireachtas to say no, we're not dealing with that. In the States they do, I think. They say no, that's a state matter or that's a local matter, please go to someone else, but it can't happen in this country at the moment until maybe there's a mindset change, or until councillors maybe stop blaming national politicians for maybe what's their responsibility.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, now I'll take Fiach first, and then we'll go to the panel.
Thank you very much, Fiach McAneil. I'd just like to ask Jerry. He had a tremendously successful stewardship of your work as a chair. Could you imagine the same success if you were an opposition politician and that job?
Okay, I want to go to the panel now because, I mean, there's a number of questions and perhaps each panel members might wish to reflect. So, John, we started with you, actually.
Thank you. I'm a bit hesitant to go as far as Angus in saying that opposition or non-government amendments should be open to imposing a tax on the people or imposing an additional charge on the government exchequer, because it is important to maintain coherence in the government's budget, and the government, having been elected by the Dáil, has a responsibility to maintain coherence. On the other hand, I think he has a good point, and maybe what one compromise might be to allow the Dáil, where it comes to a matter which involves a charge, to make a recommendation similar to the recommendation that the Senate makes, but that recommendation, if made at committee stage, would not come into effect unless and until it was accepted by the government as a substantive amendment as report. That might give you the opportunity to air the issue, but without taking the prerogative of the government away, which I think is important. I mean, the government, given that we've a debt of 125% of GDP and we've got to get it down to 60%, and we're going to have to run budget surpluses for the next 20 years to do that, governments are going to be under a lot of financial pressure, not just in this Dáil, but in the next 3 or 4 Dáil. So I think for that to be achieved, I don't think you can have the sort of American system. I mean, the most non-functional legislature in the world is the US House of Representatives at the present time, and I don't think we want to go that direction. And I as to Senator Thomas's suggestion, I think I don't mean just the scrutinising of legislation, but the amending of substantive government legislation is really the most important thing. It's even more important than private members' bills. And the fact that large acres of legislation, and it's acres of print that are not adequately scrutinised in the Dáil, that's scandalous. And I think it really is important that you put some mechanism in place to ensure that extra time is provided. But it can't be done just on the demand of the opposition. There has to be some referee that will say, well, I think we deserve to give some extra time on this particular bill, but you're only point scoring by looking for extra time on the other one. So the Count Comhairle has to be independent of both government and opposition in making that sort of decision, and that's why I do support the secret ballot idea. And I Noel was referred to clientelism. I would tend to agree with Noel that this sort of work is very educational for a member of the Dáil. You learn an awful lot. At least I did, anyway. In my 35 years, I learned an awful lot from what people came to talk to me about in clinics, and it shouldn't be dismissed. And it grounds you.
Okay, Noel, comment?
Yeah, just to reinforce what John has said there, people that criticise the approach I adopt to electoral reform tend to throw the accusation that you don't want to do constituency work. I don't care what system of government or election you have in Ireland, you're not going to get away from the public, nor should you, or your constituents or whatever else, because Ireland is so small, your constituency base would be so small. So you won't get away from that, but you could possibly reduce it, and in single-seat constituencies you would get away from the fact that not only have you to watch. I had to keep an eye on John Bruton over there, but I also had to keep an eye behind me on Mary Wallace and Colm Hillard or whoever happened to be in the constituency at the same time, because we're all competing. So the clientelism will always be a feature, but it should be reduced, I think. And in relation to Tom's question, is it encouraged by politicians? If it wasn't there, politicians wouldn't be sorry if it was gone. But I have to say, I think most politicians secretly would say they could do with a lot less of it at this stage. It does make life even more difficult. The problem I have with it, if you're a national representative, you shouldn't be trying to solve everybody's individual problem, But you should, as John said, if you've half a dozen people into your clinic over a couple of weekends telling you about the difficulty they have with, say, getting a child into a school, a child with special needs into a school, or you have a half a dozen people in telling you that, you know, their medical card is being withdrawn or whatever else, that you draw conclusions from that the system isn't working, or there's a particular individual or bureaucrat that's looking at this wrong. And as a national politician, then you have a role to play to try and fix the system. You're not a kind of an ambassador for every individual complaint. Politicians tend, instead of trying to fix the I was guilty of this. I'm not saying I was a saint on this. I was as good a constituency worker as any. But instead of trying to fix the system or fix what's broken down, it's much better from a politician's point of view to solve 6 individual problems. So you have, there are 6 families that will vote for you the next time round, and you kind of lose sight of the bigger picture. And that's, look, I'm sorry, I'm diverting a little bit. The other thing in relation to Thomas's point about this and about the local stuff, and maybe the councillors taking on more of this, well, it's back to the national politicians as well. Give them more powers at local level and give them more responsibility at local level. And in fairness, I'd have to say, and I've said it to his face, so I'll say it behind his back, that's a direction in which Phil Hogan is going. The property tax, as much and all as we mightn't like to pay it or whatever else it is, but once it's going into local services and so on, that will, I think, again, Kieran's point, over a period of time, bring about a change in culture where people will know that if the pothole isn't fixed, there's no point in going to Jerry. You need to go to your local councillor to try and get it fixed. So I think that will be helpful as well. I'll tell very quickly a very funny story about the dual mandate. When I was trying to abolish it, a colleague of mine called me aside at one stage, and he looked me earnestly in the eye and he said, "Do you realise what you're doing?" I think I do, but tell me what you think I'm doing. You realise now when this dual mandate is gone, I won't be on the council, and I'll be in here harrying ministers around about the place to make sure that they're doing what I want them to do. I did realise that. He didn't seem to, though.
Okay. Kieran, there may be a reflection you want to make, but one of the things, I mean, clearly it sounds as if the move towards a pre-legislative scrutiny phase has many advantages in terms of broadening the base from which advice is taken. But Kieran, from your point of view of management of the Dáil and your experience, would that actually speed up, the amount of legislation that the Dáil would be able to get through, on the basis that when it actually comes to the Dáil, because there's pre-scrutiny, it can pass more quickly, or would it actually add to the length of time?
Well, I suppose there's no standard answer to that, because it depends on the legislation, obviously, But I mean, if it's complicated, or some legislation obviously is more suitable to kind of where you have interest groups coming in and there's more of an interest in it. Obviously, like the point that John's making himself about the financial legislation itself has an urgency about it, because it has to be passed in a given year, because we work in the yearly cycles. So the way I look at it is that it would depend on the bill, but it would actually enhance the overall knowledge of what happens at the moment is that TDs will get lobbied by individual groups. This would be more transparent to have them at a pre-legislative side,
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I just want
Any other comments? Yeah.
I just want to pick up one point that Inglis is making about, both the restriction on the financial legislation for private members is actually constitutionally based, and the idea would be like that there's certain cut-off points, and in the Dáil is cut off much earlier, because the view would be taken that you could actually move all the restrictive rules to the end and let the bills be debated, but then it's an awful waste of Dáil time. At the end of the day, the government found that they couldn't give the government the message under Article 17.2 of the Constitution. So I remember the Labour Party before were advocating for that change and to bring it in later, but it would appear to be an awful waste of all time to go through something. At the end of the day, you couldn't proceed.
Okay. Jerry, you were asked a specific question from Fiach.
I think the answer is opposition politicians do very well in committee, and they would have success at committee. I think part of the success of the committee system is linked to equally the clerk of the committee, and I'm very fortunate I have a very good clerk in Paul Kelly who does a tremendous job. I think the balance, and John Bruton made a question there earlier, now under this government, for example, we have to bring our report on organ donation, which will be debated in the Dáil on February 21st. So before, as John Bruton rightly said, it went into the ether. Now there's a system whereby the committee, when it publishes a report, it's debated in the Dáil on a Friday sitting on the 21st of February in our case. And just in the context of the lobbying, that's the most important point. Lobbying now is done transparently and openly in terms of the pre-legislative hearing, where members who in the past would have, ministers would have had lobbying done, now they can come into the committee, make their point, and their view is known widely. And the other point, just Chairman, in terms of John Bruton earlier made reference to scripts or to Friday. On Fridays, there's no speakers list. The Count Corla calls people on a Friday, partly because maybe it's might be people there, but the Count Corla now can call people on a Friday, which is a success. In terms of scripts, last Wednesday night, Regina Doherty and I were in the Dáil. We both used no script. So I think you're right. But ministers are probably the most script using of members of the House of the Oireachtas. I think that might be one that we should look at. And just in terms of the committee work, I would make the point, Chairman, that the committee week would allow for greater scrutiny, and perhaps we should look at all legislation being debated at committee, in the committee. And the point that we haven't made yet today is the select committee in our House of the Oireachtas is different to the UK model, where they don't have to pass legislation, we do. And I think that should be noted. It hasn't been noted. And the other point is, as a practicing politician, the balance is disproportionately local work to the work related to being a parliamentarian. And the reality is, if you don't do your clinics, you don't go to meetings, you don't invest in time in the constituency, despite all the media commentary and academic commentary about reform and reform and reform. And sometimes I'd love if academics would become politicians for a day, just to see the reality. Because you can put up all the slides, with respect, and I'm fond of them all here today now. You can put up all the slides in the world and you can print all the books. But the reality is day and night. And I mean that with all respect. It's day and night.
Okay.
And the other point is, reform does happen. And if you were to listen to some of the academics this morning here, you'd swear we were in a bubble with nothing happening. There is reform happening. It is changing. Part of our difficulty, as Tom said, we don't sell that reform and we don't sell that message. But the other point is that I'm a huge advocate of the committee system, not least for members, by and large, park their party loyalties at the door, and they work in the interests of the, in the case of our case, children or health, of the people. And I think the example is that in the area of children, where we've seen a lot of things happening in children coming out of committee where it wouldn't have happened before. And I think it's, in time we will see that our committee system will perhaps be the best in Europe. But it does require resourcing. And sometimes people don't want to pay money to the Oireachtas to pay for research or to pay for advice. And when we hear this awful word consultancy, we go into a spin. But I do think we need to be honest about ourselves. If we want to fund democracy and if we want to fund Parliament, then we should do so. Because if we don't, then we get, it's the old adage, if you pay peanuts and monkeys. So, I think we should really look at that in terms of resourcing all members of Parliament.
Jerry, thank you. Meg, you made a tremendous intervention this morning, talking. Now you've been listening for the rest of the day. Any comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, a few things briefly, I hope. I'd like to come back to what Mary said at the beginning, because I think it's really important, this thing about the dilemma between balancing the sustaining role and the scrutinising role of the executive. And it's true, it's absolutely true what Mary says, that there is a trade-off here and there's a delicate balance. And there have been times in history and places in the world where parliaments have become too powerful and they've had to be reined back. But I think it's safe to say that Ireland and the UK are quite a long way away from there, and we could do with a bit more strengthening. But I mentioned before that I worked for the Leader of the House for a couple of years, and he was a great reformer, lovely man who some people may know of called Robin Cook. He was widely respected both for his extraordinary intelligence and his high principles, and he was a great man of Parliament whilst being a cabinet minister. And he used to say, good scrutiny leads to good government. When it's good scrutiny, these two things are not in conflict, because any sensible minister wants to hear if there are things wrong with his policy. And so I think what you need to be thinking about in terms of strengthening Parliament is not creating a stronger opposition, creating a more conflictual parliament, allowing more political point scoring. What you want, as I said before, is more reasoned policy making. What you want to try and encourage is people speaking not with a partisan voice, but with a parliamentary voice. And that can happen through the committees. One thing, it occurs to me, listening to John Bruton, I'm sorry if I said before that maybe you should think of having a liaison committee if you've already got one. But I'm not sure that your liaison committee is yet taking evidence from the Prime Minister as ours is. And that is an environment where you can have a sensible, more rational discussion around the table rather than point scoring. In terms of encouraging the parliamentary voice, the secret ballot for the camcorder, if I can say that right, does have great potential. But when we introduced that reform, bear in mind, it was actually a desire from the members that drove the reform. It wasn't the reform that was enforced on the members. That came about because we had a chaotic election under the old system where 12 people stood in an open ballot, and it was a disaster. It was a political embarrassment, and so it got changed. So the competition arrived first, and then the system was changed. So, and you heard earlier that you can have systems of secret ballots where people show their ballot papers to the whip. So, you know, if they don't want to go along with it, they're not going to play. Our speaker doesn't use speakers lists, has always chosen people, absolutely independently. Speakers lists are not in standing orders. That is purely cultural. So that reinforces the point that it's not always rules, it's culture maybe that you need to change. You're talking about strengthening that role. The power is already there to call members, but the power is not being used. So it's a matter of culture, not of power. And the last point maybe on these amendments with financial implications. I've been doing some work in Britain on looking at financial amendments. And actually we looked at Ireland as an example, and we were quite surprised that non-government members cannot introduce amendments with financial implications. From a British point of view, that looks pretty restrictive. So maybe the suggestion from John Bruton that came earlier in the day as well, to allow at least recommendations, would be a sensible kind of compromise position.
Thank you. Mary, I'm going to give you the last word on this. Any reflections on what you've heard since you spoke last?
Well, I think it's quite striking that we have a number of political representatives here at the top tables from differing political backgrounds, and they're really all speaking the same message in advocating different types of reform. And I suppose it would be wonderful if that could be harnessed within the chamber itself on a cross-party basis. And an idea that Meg mooted this morning in relation to our subcommittee on Dáil reform, that perhaps changing the composition of that particular subcommittee might be worth considering, involving backbenchers in it more substantially, perhaps drawing on outside expertise and interest groups to inform maybe 2 or 3 or 4 solid proposals in relation to some of the discussions that have been pioneered here today. And I think it would also be very useful to harness the influence and the knowledge and the insight that former parliamentarians can bring to these particular questions. And I in the past have criticised All Éireann for not drawing on that capacity and on that wisdom to inform its future. So I suppose I would commend the politicians for their openness today and genuinely encourage them to grasp what's on offer and what they're capable of doing in terms of making the House better than it is.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'm sorry, we're going to have to draw to a close because we're already beyond our time. But I just want to very simply thank all of the panel members for what I think has been a tremendous session. Thank you very much.